in mid-June of 2025, a shooting war erupted between Iran and Israel, with Israeli military forces launching attacks against multiple Iranian military sites, alongside sites associated with its nuclear program, and against individual Iranian military leaders. Iran responded to these strikes, which left a lot of infrastructural damage and several military leaders assassinated, with large waves of missiles and drones against both Israeli and allied military targets. And soon after, later the same month, both sides agreed on a ceasefire, and that was that. Following that blip of a war, though, Iran's economy suffered greatly. It already wasn't doing well, in part due to the crippling sanctions enforced by the US government for years, but also because of persistent mismanagement by Iran's ruling regime, and the resultant deterioration of local infrastructure, both physical and bureaucratic. Millions of people fled Iranian urban centers during the war with Israel, and while most of them returned when the ceasefire was brokered, the pace of life and other fundaments of these cities never got back up to where they were before, as there have been fairly consistent blackouts that have kept people from being able to function as normal, and these outages have also kept businesses from getting back on their feet. That in turn has resulted in closures and firings, and an overall reduction of economic activity. The general ham-handedness of the government has amplified these issues, and the countless other issues of trying to exist within a country that is being so persistently targeted, both in the sense of those crushing sanctions from the US, but also in the sense of being periodically struck by Israel. All of that has dramatically increased uncertainty throughout Iran these past several years. Even before that brief war, Iran was already on the back foot, having suffered the loss of their local proxies, including the Assad regime in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, all of which have been either severely weakened by Israel in recent years or fundamentally wiped out, and that in turn has more directly exposed Iran to meddling and attacks from their key opposition, which includes the US, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. That new vulnerability has put the Iranian government on high alert, and the compounding effects of all that infrastructural damage, mismanagement, and the need to reallocate more resources to defense has left the country suffering very high levels of inflation, a severely devalued currency, regular blackouts, mass unemployment, a water shortage, and long-time repression from a government that is in many ways more paranoid and flailing than at any time in recent memory. What I'd like to talk about today is a recent wave of protests across Iran and why the US government is apparently considering taking action to support protesters against the Iranian government. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. Iran has long suffered all sorts of issues, including regular efforts by ethnic secessionists to pull it apart into pieces that they periodically occupy and want to take and govern for themselves, and concerns from citizens that the government spends a whole lot of their time and the nation's resources enriching themselves, oppressing the citizenry, funding what seems to be a pointless nuclear program, and prioritizing their offensive efforts against Israel and their other regional enemies, often by arming and funding those aforementioned, now somewhat defunct proxy militias and militaries. On top of all that, as of October 2025, inflation in Iran has surged to 48.6%, and the Iranian currency, the rial, dropped in value to 1.45 million per dollar. The government tried to artificially boost the value of the rial to 1.38 million per dollar in early January of 2026, but it dropped further after that to 1.5 million per dollar a few days later, hitting a record low. This combined with that wild inflation rate made the basic fundamentals of life, food, electricity, things like that, unaffordable, even for those who still had jobs, which was an ever-shrinking portion of the population. For context, the drop of the rial to a value of 1.38 million per dollar, the boosted value, the artificial one set by the government, represented a loss of about 40% of the rial's value since June of 2025, just before that war with Israel, which is a staggering loss, as that means folks' life savings lost that much value in about half a year. When currency values and inflation hit that level of volatility, doing business becomes difficult. It often makes more sense to just close up shop than to try to keep the doors open, because you don't know if the price you charge for your product or service will make you a profit. There is a chance that you will sell things at a loss because the value of the money you receive and the cost of goods that you require, both to survive personally and to keep your business functioning, will change before the day ends, or maybe even before a sale can be completed. Iran's economic crisis has further exploded in the past weeks then, because all of those issues have compounded and spiraled to the point that simply selling things and buying things have become too risky for many people and entities. And that means folks are having even more trouble getting food and keeping the lights on than before, which becomes a real survival issue on top of the regular crackdowns and abuses by the government that they have suffered in various ways and with various intensities for decades. In 2022, those abuses and limits on personal rights for citizens in Iran led to large protests that were catalyzed by the death of a 22-year-old woman named Mahsa Amini, who was in police custody for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. Those 2022 protests were historically large, the biggest in the country by some estimates at least, since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. On December 28, 2025, a group of shopkeepers in Iran's capital city, Tehran, went on strike, closing their shops in protest against what's been happening with Iran's economy. And again, it is basically impossible to safely do business in a country with that much inflation and a currency that is devalued to that degree. Other shopkeepers followed suit, and large protests formed around these closed shops. Those protests flooding social media platforms in short order, and protesters shouting slogans that indicated they were pissed off about the economic mismanagement in the country, and then that eventually led to general anti-government slogans being shouted as well. Things remained peaceful at these protests at first, and they expanded across the country within the next few days, shops closing, and then people filling the streets around those shops. By the fourth day, police had started to use live ammunition and tear gas against protesters. Some of the protesters were killed, and things began to spiral from there. By December 31st of 2025, the government ordered a total nationwide business shutdown to try to get ahead of these protests, which again tended to revolve around the shutdown of businesses as a protest. The government said that they were making this call, shutting down all these businesses because of cold weather, but the writing was kind of on the wall that they were scrambling to make it look like businesses were shutting down because they said so, not in protest of their handling of the economy. The government also announced that they would start cracking down on protesters hard on the first day of 2026, and that caused things to escalate further, police using even more force against those who gathered, which of course then led to more protests in more places and more angry slogans being shouted and more protester deaths at the hands of government forces. Protests had spread to all 31 Iranian provinces by early January of 2026, and at this point there were only 17 confirmed deaths. US President Trump got involved around this time, maybe feeling confident, following the successful nighttime grab of Venezuelan President Maduro. Whatever the case, he warned the Iranian government not to shoot protesters, or the US government might have to get involved, coming to the protesters' rescue. Iran's government responded by saying the rioters must be put in their place. They suppressed the funerals of protesters, and they muffled local internet service, slowing access speeds and increasing the number of outages by about a third. They threatened to execute hundreds of protesters by hanging, then said they wouldn't, and Trump declared this decision to not execute all those prisoners to be a personal victory, though the Iranian government used his insinuation of possible strikes against them as an opportunity to position the fight as Iran versus the United States. And in that framing of things, the protesters are backed by their great enemy through Trump's threats against them. The government then started forcing captured protesters to make confessions on video, which only seemed to further anger the not yet arrested protesters. And some protesters began to fight back, too, in one case setting a police officer on fire. And in other cases, local militia groups defended protesters against police, leading to several deaths on all sides. Iran's government shut down more communication services in an attempt to regain control, in some cities taking down the internet completely, though some information, photos, and videos of police abuses of protesters still made it out into the wider world using satellite services like Starlink. And by the 9th of January, protests reached a scale that rivaled and maybe surpassed those seen during the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which put the current regime into power. And protesters began to set fire to buildings associated with the Islamic Republic, the government, and directly clashing with security forces in some cases. Hundreds of people were reportedly killed per day from that point forward, and thousands were rushed to hospitals, overwhelming medical facilities and doctors. Thousands of people were also violently killed by police under cover of the now complete internet blackout. And on January 10th, it was estimated that around 2,000 protesters had been killed in the preceding 2 days alone, while other estimates from inside and outside Iran ranged from 12,000 to 20,000 protesters killed by the government. The most reliable source I could find that tends to be most accurate in these sorts of situations, as of last weekend at least, indicated that the true number of dead is probably something like 3,300 people as a minimum. In the past week or so, the Iranian government has apparently figured out how to jam Starlink internet signals, making it even more difficult for protesters to share what is happening in the country. And President Trump posted on his social network, Truth Social, telling Iranian citizens that they should overthrow the government and that help is on the way. The Iranian government has arrested tens of thousands of people. They have tanks patrolling their towns and cities, and it seems to have successfully quashed protests for the time being. No protests at all were reported across the country as of mid-January. And so many people were killed and injured that hospitals and other institutions are still overwhelmed trying to work through their backlog. Much of the country is also in mourning. Government forces are reportedly going door to door to arrest people who are spotted in CCTV and social media footage participating in protests. And they've set up checkpoints to stop people randomly to look through their phones and arrest them if any photos or videos are found that indicate they were at protests, deleting that digital evidence in the process as well. This remains a fast-moving story, and there is a chance that something significant, like the US striking Iranian government targets or renewed, more focused protests by locals, will arise in the coming days and weeks. Some analysts have argued that it's kind of a no-brainer for the Trump administration to hit Iranian government targets while that government is strained in this way, because it's a longtime enemy of the US and its allies, and it is currently very weak. And doing so would reinforce the narrative, for some people at least, that was sparked with the capture of Maduro, that the Trump administration is anti-tyrant, which is questionable by many measures, especially what's happening on the home front here in the United States. But again, this is a narrative, not necessarily reality, and narratives are powerful, especially going into an election year. It's also possible that because economic conditions in Iran have not changed, that this is just the beginning of something bigger. Protesters and militias taking a step back, taking a moment to regain their footing and to mourn those who were lost, and taking a moment to consider what they might do to have even more of an impact when they start the protests back up again. The book I'd like to recommend today is called Post-Growth Living, or An Alternative Hedonism by Kate Soper. A quick snippet from the publisher about this book does a good job of explaining what it's about, I think. The reality of runaway climate change is inextricably linked with the mass consumerist capitalist society in which we live, and the cult of endless growth and endless consumption of cheap disposable commodities isn't only destroying the world, it is damaging ourselves and our way of being. How do we stop the impending catastrophe, and how can we create a movement capable of confronting it head-on? This book has some good arguments and perspectives, I think, even for folks who don't necessarily reflexively agree with the premise. And if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of Post-Growth Living by Kate Soper. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.